back then it had to be personally delivered. And so when Paul wants to get this letter he has crafted to Rome, he has to choose a messenger in order to take it there. Someone who would be well connected with the communities there, someone who would be able to likely read his letter to the communities in Rome, be able to explain it as well if they had any questions. So Paul is going to be rather selective as to who he picks in order to send to Rome with his letter.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical text. Today's guest is Jason Borges, and we'll be discussing travel in the ancient world, and particularly how that relates to an individual mentioned by Paul in Romans chapter 16, Phoebe, and what her role may have been. And this is a pretty interesting thesis, and we get into some stuff that is a helpful explainer, I think, or a primer of the differences between what travel is like for us, how commerce has essentially limited us from the kinds of social networks that were needed for travel to be possible at all. As always, if you want to reach out to me for any reason, guest suggestions, feedback, if you have a recipe that you want to share with me, hit me up at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Jason Borges. Jason Borges, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I am an American citizen, grew up in America, but have been living in Turkey for the last 7 years. And I work at the Asia Minor Research Center, where I do biblical research and training in the country of Turkey. And I have recently finished my PhD at Durham University, actually 2023, so about a year ago. And my focus there was on the topic of early Christian travel.
Okay. So I feel like being in Turkey, maybe sometimes if you're talking about early Christian history, you might be able to hold on, let me go outside and check to see if that's right. Is that something you could pull off?
Yeah.
Okay.
It is a great privilege of being here in Turkey. And it's kind of the reason why we're based here, is to be able to bring in material culture into my research. And it does kind of help give a new perspective and kind of maybe a third dimensional type of perspective on things. And obviously for teaching and training, we work with different academic groups or church groups that come over here and work on site with them as well. So yeah, it is a great privilege. Unfortunately, my children, are a little bit tired of all the historical sites in Turkey. They don't want to see another one. And so we have maybe seen too many of the historical sites. I haven't, but apparently they have.
My guess is, though, if they have a dad that's taking them to historical sites in Turkey, he would probably be taking them to historical sites in Virginia or Missouri or anywhere else that you might live.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of a fan of Greco-Roman history, and so not as much, I guess. So yeah, and there's just a complete abundance of sites here, and so it's they're just kind of everywhere. So
That's fair. Okay, I'll cut the chit chat and we'll go straight to. So we're discussing your Journal of Biblical Literature article,
yeah,
titled "Phoebe, a Host of Christian Travelers: The Meaning of Pṟostatis in Romans 16:2." Did I get that right? The pronunciation. So the thesis, obviously, that word "pṛostatis" is kind of central to what you're saying. Can you walk us through why that word is significant and what you're doing in your article?
Yeah. So yeah, essentially my argument is trying to define this word and imagine what did Paul mean by it, and then specifically why did Paul use this word to describe Phoebe? Kind of what's this word doing for him rhetorically? So basically, I can talk about some of the previous interpretations in the past. This word prostatis has been translated sometimes as helper. The older translations, which has a more kind of subordinate diminutive role, as if she was kind of like, Paul's secretary type of thing. And there's been a reaction against that because the word prostatis that he calls Phoebe is the feminine form of this another Greek word prostates, which just simply means someone who stands in front or is a leader, as a benefactor of some kind. And so now I think it's pretty common in translations for it to be translated as patron or benefactor, which I think is accurate. But then the question becomes, in what way was she a patron or a benefactor? In what ways did she use her money and her prominence in order to support others? And so, there's different explanations for that. Some people just kind of leave it general. She was an affluent person who used kind of her largesse to do good. Robert Jewett will talk more specifically that she was going to be a patroness or a sponsor for Paul's mission to Spain as he was looking to go further west. Others would talk about how she hosted the weekly Christian gathering in her house, which is plausible as well. And so I think those all could be a part of it, but that's not specifically what Paul has in mind. I think Paul specifically has in mind that she is a host of she is a host of Christian travelers who are coming in and out of Corinth through the port city of Cenchreae, where she is based at and where she lives at. And so I take it to mean that she is a host of Christian travelers, which is kind of given away in the title of my paper there. And so I think this makes the most sense. We can talk about it, because it explains, Paul says she was a prostatis to both me and others. So how was she a patron to both Paul and others, looking in the past? And then looking forward, what is the function of Paul's words choice as he is writing this to the Romans? Why does Paul want the Romans to know her as a prostatis, and specifically know that she has been one to both Paul and to other people? How does that work into his kind of rhetoric and his theological aims within the letter? So what I'm proposing, I just want to be clear, is not like new or novel. Other people have said that. The earliest one that I saw was Origen, so early 3rd century, and other commentators have kind of mentioned it. But it's usually gets like a 1 or 2 sentence explanation of like, this is probably most plausible. And so I wanted to move it from kind of from plausible to more probable. And so look at any potential evidence that there is to support this idea that she actually was a host within the Christian community and helping out Christian travelers who were coming in and out of Corinth. So that's kind of what I was looking to do with this article here.
So a couple things. Well, one, if you can get into the context of why it would be necessary for someone to host people, I'm not sure that resonates with the experience of modern people in general. But then, and this may take a second, I think my personal understanding of patronage in antiquity, in the Roman world, it's kind of stuck with like the patronage and power John Chow model, which I wonder if it's outdated. So just real quick for listeners, that idea was, you have a patron and they provide material support for their clients, and their clients provide whatever, whether it's, political support or something else. And that goes on and on and on in layers from the emperor all the way down. Are we looking at something that's kind of like that, or is it a little bit more fluid? So, and I can try to condense that if you need me to.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, so 2 parts. Let me take the first part. You're absolutely right in stating that we modern people have a hard time understanding the need for such hospitality when we travel. And the reason why is because, for example, if you're going to go, say you're going to Rome, the same destination as Phoebe, what you would probably do is go to Airbnb.com and look at some places, or maybe look at Google Maps to try to get some hotels there. So all this information and access is available to you online for you to be able to find something. You're going to carry your passport in order to establish your identity as to who you are. You're going to take your credit card in order to purchase the goods and the services that you need. Well, all of these forms of technology, the internet, the passport, the credit cards, what they do is they abstract away out problems and they remove all the friction of travel. So whenever you leave your house in your immediate community where your needs are typically met, and you're dislocated from your community, you're going to have certain needs met. And so through modern technology, those needs get met pretty easily. Whereas in the first century, they didn't have those sort of resources. So when a person left their polis, when they left their town or community, where they were known and protected and had resources for sustenance, they had to find another social network in order to meet those needs, in order to be fed and be protected and to be housed, essentially. And so there were not hotels. There kind of were hotels in the ancient world, but they were brothels. Nobody wanted to stay at them. They were very dirty and disgusting. And so even the pagans, Christians, Jews all kind of looked down upon them. And so it's always the preference of people to stay with people that you knew, not simply because they had a nice, you get a better bed and a better meal that way, but they actually provided coverage and protection, identity. If you had any issues or problems, they would say, hey, this is my friend Jared, I vouch for him, therefore he is kind of one of us, don't treat him as an outsider, to kind of explain that in more contemporary terms. So hence the importance of having host, or the function of hospitality, to create, to ease out to remove all the friction and the difficulties of travel in the ancient world. And this becomes very important within the Christian community, because you have, or within the broader Christian church in the 1st and 2nd century, because you have all these communities that are spread out across the Mediterranean, and they're interacting with one another. They're sending letters, they're sending funds to one another, they're passing on news and helping one another. And in order for all of this movement to happen, you're going to have local hosts in these different communities who would be able to host people, which I think involves kind of a twofold element. One, providing a housing for them, what we typically think of hospitality, but then also there's kind of a legal advocacy to it as well. I should say communal advocacy as well, where they come under your social persona, and therefore they're protected and can function within this new community that they're in. So does that kind of answer the first question about how the need for hospitality and host in the ancient world?
Absolutely.
So there's that. And then you bring up patronage. What is patronage? That's $1 million question. There's all kinds of squabbles and debates over it. The simple answer is that patronage is a reciprocal relationship among two unequal people. So you have somebody who's more prominent, who has resources, and then you have clients who have needs. And so the patron is someone who gives to the clients. And because the relationship is reciprocal, the client cannot repay financially or in kind back to the patron. So what they do is they repay socially. So they give honor and respect and loyalty or votes to their patron. And so it's essentially a way for elites to convert their wealth or their financial capital into social capital, honor, prestige, reputation. So this can take many different forms. In the Roman world, the Latin word patronus meant more of a legal advocate. Whenever you had some sort of problem or issue in the community, you went to somebody who had kind of political or legal connections. And so you had your patronus who could advocate on your behalf. And every day the clients would show up at the door of the patron and kind of sing praises to him and do his bidding. And whenever the patron walked around town, all the clients had to follow along in their entourage. Within the Greek East, they used a different word called euergetes, or we often call it euergetism, translated as benefaction. And so in these contexts, the patronage or the expression of this was not so much personal, but public. And so this is where wealthy elites used their money in order to build monumental buildings on behalf of the community, or they would use their money in order to finance kind of large-scale events, say processions, religious processions, or political events, or holiday celebrations, in which animals were sacrificed and everyone got to eat and celebrate, and everyone benefited from that. So those are two common ways at the large scale of how patronage and benefaction work. But we need to understand the ancient world that there were small-scale patronage relationships up and down society. So even someone who wasn't, at the top of the totem pole, more in the middle, just to speak roughly, still had people that they were responsible for, and still had people looking up to them for help and for patronage and for benefaction. And so this can take the form of, hospitality, of, paying for medical bills, for helping out in a legal situation, whatever it may be. And so the idea of patronage, there is the official, or I guess formal position of being a patron or being called a euergetes, but it's also just an abstract idea that gets applied all throughout society in a variety of relationships. And so one of these, I think, is hospitality as well. So one type of patronage is hospitality. So that's why throughout the paper, I call Phoebe a host patron. I know it's kind of a made up word, but trying to get at this idea of the way in which she functioned as a Pṛstatis.
I mean, all words are made up. So go nuts.
Yeah.
Okay, so combining the two answers that you gave to the two questions that I had, we have, I think, probably commercial solutions to what had to be human problems. So when you say hospitality in the contemporary world, you think, at least I think of hospitality as an industry.
Yeah.
And then there really isn't much of an equivalent, maybe outside of politics or in the workplace, of the kind of patronage that you're describing. So it is kind of foreign, but it to get back to the question of Phoebe, it does kind of indicate, if this title is being used of her and that's the context, or those are the contexts, that she has the material capability of caring for people, of providing hospitality, and probably the social standing that comes with that material ability. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a fair. Of course, we don't know for sure because we have so little information about Phoebe. All we know about her are these two verses. Romans 16, verses 1 and 2. There's no other mentions to her, either within the New Testament, outside of it, or in any other shape. So our understanding of who she was is limited to these verses. But considering how Paul describes her, and how I've kind of reconstructed the meaning of Pṛstatis, I think that's fair to say.
I think it could be also added to that the fact that he mentions her, because you had to be selective with how, like, writing materials were not cheap. They were not easy to come by necessarily. And so writing a letter, you had to know what you were going to say. And so it had to be a significant thing, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so there's the issue of the composition of the letter, which itself was a big deal, as you bring up. And obviously Romans would have taken some time and significant resources in order to compose. But then you also have to deliver the letter, right? This is another issue. When we want to write something, we email it out, or we can publish a book, and it's fairly easy. It's easy to deliver our information. But back then, it had to be personally delivered. And so when Paul wants to get this letter he has crafted to Rome, he has to choose a messenger in order to take it there, someone who would be well connected with the communities there, someone who would be able to likely read his letter to the communities in Rome, be able to explain it as well if they had any questions. So Paul is going to be rather selective as to who he picks in order to send to Rome with his letter. And so this is exactly what's going on here in Romans 16:1. Paul says, I commend to you Phoebe. Now that's a standard kind of language from Greek letters for a letter of commendation. So basically when someone is traveling from person A to person B, and when A and B know each other, but the person going doesn't know, the receiving party, person A will write a letter to them and say, hey, I want you to receive this person and do whatever you can to help them. And so we have hundreds of these letters called commendation letters or recommendation letters in which the recipient is being asked to help out, to host, and to welcome the person who is carrying this letter. And this is exactly what Paul is doing. So Phoebe is the person who is delivering his letter to the church in Rome.
Since you kind of focus broadly on travel in early Christianity, do we know of networks of people who were providing this kind of hospitality in early Christianity for travel?
So we can get into it a little bit. I think Phoebe would be one of these people. I would also argue that Philemon was a figure like this in Colossae. You have Lydia as well, who is in Philippi, who welcomes Paul when he is there. And so what's interesting is that in a proselytological survey in the New Testament, Edwin Judge identified up to 40 people who were function as prominent hosts within the community. It's interesting, a lot of them are female as well. So we have kind of a substantial list of different people who function like this within the Christian community. But I would qualify that by saying that the information we have about them are usually just all one-time references, right? And so someone like Phoebe, we only know about this because of the small, one-time window that we get about her. And so, we don't get like repeated mentions or kind of extended descriptions of these sort of figures. And I think, much more the emphasis on early Christian literature is actually upon the itinerant, the person who is traveling, right? So we know a lot about Timothy or Titus or Paul, these people who are going around and proclaiming the good news and ministering in these regions. And so they were the more kind of prominent upfront people. They were also the ones who wrote letters. And so kind of we get their version of the story, but their ministries were entirely dependent upon hosts as well, who received them and welcomed them and provided the platform for them in order to speak.
How about extra biblically? Do we know much about the context that helps?
Yeah. What's really interesting, Didache, is a book that dates to the late 1st century. And so it's kind of teachings for the early Christian community. And there are 2 chapters in there essentially about what type of itinerants a Christian should host. And so it gives instructions to them as well. I would say 2nd and 3rd John, you have a similar situation as well. And so where this author, John, is writing to these communities in order, telling them who they should host and who they shouldn't, what type of teachers they should welcome and on what terms. So we have kind of general instruction and general teaching that is written by Christian leaders to host communities in different places, giving them instructions on how to host and who to host. But as for actual specific people and what they did and what that looked like, we don't have any extended descriptions of it, at least nothing that's coming to mind as well. We get these select windows, and so what we need to do is kind of infer and deduce and reconstruct things from these little glimpses that we get. So another great example, I think, is Ignatius of Antioch, when he is arrested and convicted in Antioch, and he is sent to Rome in order to die as a martyr there, travels across Asia Minor, and he stays in several of the churches en route, specifically in Smyrna. And so while he's in Smyrna, where Polycarp is the bishop there, several churches come to visit him, and he is taken care of there. And he seems to have very favorable reception by the communities that are there, according to a letter that he writes back to the church in Smyrna. So we get these kind of glimpses, when as Christians are moving, obviously they had to have some sort of, hospitality connections in place. And so we can try to work back and infer that. And then, in my article, we can talk about this as you want, but in my article, what I try to bring up is the institution of Proxenia, which is essentially the main civic institution or social institution that was employed in Greek cities in order to facilitate travel between the city-states. And so I think that provides kind of a good working model to understand how these hosts functioned and what it meant for them to welcome and to take care of travelers.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that actually, my questions are over here on the side.
Okay.
And that caught my eye. So if you want to, but it actually kind of sounds like it's most of the record is like positive Yelp reviews. Is that?
I like that. Kind of, giving a shout out, 5 stars to Phoebe because, she provided, a nice clean place and left some good coffee on the counter for me, for me, Paul, and for many others type of thing. I guess so. Yeah, you could see it that way. And so it's kind of Yelp reviews that are completely accidental, right? That, accidentally got preserved within the historical record. And we try to work back through this Yelp review to understand who the person was.
But it even goes beyond that, because it's like, now make sure there's, a nice comforter on the bed for Phoebe. It's not
Yeah.
just she did a good job, it's please do a good job for her, right?
Yes. So yeah, that's where the whole analogy breaks down. Is so in the modern world, if we receive good hospitality service, our repayment, well, we pay in cash, in money, to pay off that debt, and then if it's extra good, then we leave a 5-star review. But after that, there is zero expectation of the Airbnb owner ever calling us up and say, "Hey, Jared, you stayed in my place, when you came to San Francisco. I'm coming out to your place. Can I stay with you?" That would just be like you know, uh, extraordinarily weird and unacceptable socially. But in the ancient world, that is how it worked. And so Phoebe welcomed and hosted many people. And so she functioned as a host. Well, now that she is being dislocated from her primary community in Cancri, and she needs a kind of a support community, a place to stay, and people to provide coverage and identity for her, as she goes to Rome, Paul is saying to them, "Hey, I need you to do for her what she has done for many other people." Um, so, yeah, that's exactly it. So, Phoebe's hospitality is not simply the reason why Paul sends her to Rome, but it's also the model and the example which he expects the Romans to follow in welcoming her.
I do want to get to Proxenia, but I kind of want to highlight it. Okay, it seems to me, I'm middle aged now, but really since I was in my early 20s, that the voices calling for a return to a bygone era have gotten louder, and uh, it's almost treated that, so like you say, if I stay at a hotel, I pay my bill, we settle up at the end, and no
Yeah,
one owes anything anymore.
yeah,
Uh, and so we're like, well, that's transactional. But this is transactional too. There are just more loose ends. There is no guarantee that the hospitality you pay will, or that you provide, will ever be provided to you. You may never need it. And
hmm
so but I think there's maybe an effort sometimes in people's minds to elevate that morally or ethically to a superior position, when really what it is like, life is tough and the
yeah,
world is hard when you're doing everything by hand. And so you have to have these networks, and we have just substituted that
yeah.
with commercial interactions and made it more efficient. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what happens with capitalism, right? They kind of take over these markets or these relational exchanges. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that sense. And so the relationships back then were transactional, but I would say a better word is reciprocal, right? Everyone is giving and receiving, but unlike our transactional relationships, where you give one thing or you receive one thing and you give another thing, and then that's the end of the relationship. In the reciprocal relationships of the ancients, and I would even say many people in the majority world today, the relational interaction does not end after a repayment. It continues kind of indefinitely into the future. And so the initial receiving and giving is simply the beginning of a long-term relationship with ongoing giving and receiving, or reciprocity.
From there, can we discuss Proxenia?
Yeah.
What is this concept?
Yeah. So Proxenia is this. It's a Greek social institution that's really was prominent in the classical and Hellenistic era. So think, from 500 BC essentially up to the year 0, before the time of the Roman Empire. And remember that there was no large scale government or kind of empire in those days. All of the cities or polises, the city states, function independently and autonomously. And so, whenever someone wanted to travel from city A to city B, as we've been talking about, they didn't go to a local hotel, they didn't stay at Airbnb. They needed someone there in that community in order to receive them. So, say, for example, the people of Corinth often traveled to Troas, just completely hypothetical. And they have various business dealings in Troas. And so a group of people in Corinth will identify someone in Troas who has agreed to welcome them whenever they come. This person in Troas would provide a place to stay and would also provide this covering for them if they had any kind of business or legal issues while they were in Troas. And so in response, the people in Corinth would pass a civic decree to recognize this local person in Troas, a prominent person, obviously, who would be able to do this, as a proxenos. And so they would issue a civic decree, and they would inscribe that decree on stone. And so this is how we mostly know about Proxenia. About 2,500 Proxenia decrees from the ancient Greek cities have been found. And so you have to remember that we have only a small fraction of the overall inscriptions. And so scholars have estimated there were over 1 million total Proxenia decrees that were issued from Greek cities, which shows it's very prevalent and very common. These inscriptions were publicly erected, and so it was common knowledge as to how this institution functioned. And so this proxenos was honored. Whenever the person from Troas would come to Corinth, he would get a certain seat, in the theater. He would be able to purchase land, essentially becoming like a local citizen, and he would receive different civic benefits within Corinth in exchange for the services he provided to the Corinthians whenever they went to Troas. So that is Proxenia. That is the main way that, the main kind of institution, I should say, kind of the Airbnb network of the ancient world. When someone wanted to travel from their community to another one, how did they do it and ensure a sense of safety and provision when they went there? This becomes significant for the argument of my paper because in these Proxenia inscriptions, it is very common for the people, for these civic cities who issued the decrees, to call their proxenos a prystatis. And so all throughout these inscriptions, these two terms are used interchangeably. And then what's interesting is there's actually a guy in Byzantium in the Hellenistic age who wrote a dictionary, and he said, he's defining all these words, and he says a proxenos is a prystatis in a certain city, or by virtue of a civic decree in a city. So he equates the two ideas. And so I think a prystatis is a little bit more of a general term than proxenia, but I do think, based on these inscriptions and the epigraphy, that this idea of hospitality seems to be an inherent and latent part of prystatis. It absolutely was for proxenia. Like a proxenia was by definition a host to foreigners. And it seems to appear that proxenia, that being a prystatis was a very similar idea. So that's why I bring in proxenia. That's why I think it's so significant. Even though, I just want to be clear, Phoebe is not called a proxenos. No one in the New Testament is called a proxenos. But I do think it was a general paradigm, or kind of a set of expectations and assumptions that structured relationships between an itinerant traveler and a local host that would have come into play for Phoebe, as she was a prystatis in Cenchreae, receiving itinerant travelers, and also when she became a traveler and went to Rome as well. So that's why I feel like it's a helpful kind of heuristic social model that can help us understand these dynamics that were at play in these interactions with Phoebe.
So one is like a legal or official designation, and the other one is a little bit more informal. So the formal can encompass the informal, but the informal may not necessarily encompass the definition or understanding of the formal.
Yes, and proxenos being the more formal. Usually it's formalized, but again, we can have kind of an informal expectations of the proxenia paradigm. But in general, it tends to get more formalized and official. But and then prystatis would be a little bit more general and informal term. But again, based on the inscriptions and different evidence, there is significant overlap and around the idea of hospitality, or the expectations of hospitality and provision from these figures.
Something that you said, and I don't remember what it was that triggered this, but reminded me. So Paul is a diaspora Jew, right? He's from Tarsus, and it's very likely that he he had to do some traveling even before he became a follower of Jesus, right? Probably for pilgrimage and things.
Yeah, going to Israel. He studied with Gamaliel, so it seemed like he, spent some time, obviously, in Palestine, Judea area.
Are the networks established for that kind of travel? Is that something that's known to us within Jewish communities throughout the diaspora world?
And that's a good question. It is a little bit, and it happened through the synagogue, essentially. So I'm not as much of an expert on this, but essentially synagogues were more like community centers than what we would think of as like a religious building. And so it's where the community came together for education, and also often had different rooms to accommodate fellow Jewish travelers. And so we see this there's a really famous inscription from a synagogue in Jerusalem. I think it's first century CE, that describes the synagogue and all of the hospitality rooms that were rebuilt as a part of it in the dedicatory inscription. So yeah, it does appear to have happened. We don't have a lot of direct evidence for it, or to know exactly kind of who is able to participate in that. And so, Paul, as part of his mission strategy, seemed to go to the synagogues and Jewish communities first. And so was that purely a theological missional reason, or was there also just a functional reason? As he goes in these new communities, he, as a Jew, would stay with fellow Jews because they would host him and they provided an open door for him. And so I think there is that element as well early on in his in his mission work.
So I guess that was me kind of setting up this question, which is, do you think that the networks established within early Christianity were they making use of just a broader Greco-Roman understanding of this kind of hospitality, prostatis hospitality? Were they, or like within the general public, was it within synagogues, or was it both, or some other mixture of things?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. How does travel within the Christian network compare and contrast to kind of the broader Greco-Roman role? I would say, as a whole, the ways in which they traveled and the relationships that were created through travel are fairly similar in terms of the kind of patterns of exchange. What is different, I would say it's kind of two things that are different. For Christians who tend to be non-elites, there was a significant amount of travel. It appears as though Christians are traveling more than the typical Greco-Roman person. And the other thing that's significant as well is, who are they receiving? And so this is always a significant thing. Usually travel was occurring through the elites. And so they would create, the word that they used for it was a friend, essentially. And so a friend in these distant locations that they'd be able to travel to. And so only people of the upper class, the elites, would have a network in place in order to facilitate their movement across space through different cities. Whereas we have here, and so the reason why, or the basis for that welcome, essentially becomes their elite status. And in order to kind of, build out your Rolodex, you welcome people, establish them, and then when time comes, you can call in favors from them. Whereas for Christians, their motive, or their who gets to participate in this travel network, is based upon their kind of religious allegiance or their commitment to Christ. And so it becomes unique in that sense, because how they define the community becomes different. It's no longer based on social distinction. It's not based on blood relation or ethnicity, but it is based on their profession of faith to Christ and their kind of common adherence to that.
So it's, I don't know. I don't want to make this sound reductive, but I'm just going to throw it out there and you can correct me. So it's a kind of enforcement mechanism for behavior and participation?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I would just say it just naturally developed. Is this a reward? Is it a threat? Is it kind of a benefit of it? It just seems to be a reality that Christians, as they come to identify with one another by virtue of their common, faith in Christ, kind of start developing new family-like relationships with one another. And so they're sharing not just in hospitality, but they're sharing funds with one another. So you have Gentiles, all the way from Corinth and from Macedonia who are sending money to, Jewish Christians in Palestine. People who are, bringing money when Paul's in prison in different locations. People are sending money to help him there. And so there's an incredible amount of resources that are being transacted across space. And I think kind of the hospitality part that we've just focused in, I think, is just part of the infrastructure or the platform upon which all of that happens. I don't think Christians, set out to develop this. I think it just kind of happened as they were moving about and as it was necessary, as they were moving information and resources around. They naturally this hospitality network would have naturally emerged. And I think it goes hand in hand, remember as well, that Christians met in homes for the first 300 years. And so they were not dedicated church buildings. And so what that means is that within the local community on a weekly basis, everyone would gather inside of the home of the most prominent person. And so we already see this happening, and 3 John is, a vivid example of this. And so because of that, you already have in place someone who is a prominent person within the Christian community who is using their status and their resources in order to provide a space for other people. That was for the local community on a weekly basis, but that those same resources were there and were in place whenever an itinerant came into town and needed a place to stay for a week as well. And so I think there is the whole travel infrastructure is kind of piggybacking simply on, the regular gatherings that are happening, these communal meals that seem to be happening within the early church.
I don't want to leave her out. So can you tell us about Junia Theodora and how she is relevant to the conversation around Phoebe?
Yeah. So for our purposes, she's actually very similar to Phoebe. She was a prominent woman who lived in Corinth in the 1st century, probably actually the 2nd quarter of it. So we're talking like the 30s, 40s, 50s, again, similar to Phoebe. And we know about her because of an inscription that was found in the 1950s in Corinth. And on that inscription was inscribed 5 or 6 letters that were sent to her from the people of Lycia, this a region within southwestern Asia Minor. And in it, the cities and the koinon, or the common group of Lycian cities, sent these letters to Junia Theodora, thanking her specifically for her hospitality. They had come there either as political exiles or as business people. Regardless of why they came, when they got there, they were greatly assisted by Junia Theodora. And it specifically says that she welcomed them into her home to receive them. She also provided important connections for them among the political class within Corinth. And so we have someone who's doing a fairly similar thing. And in one of these letters, they actually thank her, or they describe this work that she has performed on behalf of the Lycians as Proxenia, Prostatia, the kind of the abstract noun form of prostatis, the term that's used for Phoebe. So considering all of these similarities and the linguistic connection between Junia Theodora and Phoebe, I think it's important to understand exactly why she was called why her work was described as prostatia as it related to hospitality, and that carries over to Phoebe and kind of provides some additional color or some evidence for understanding Phoebe as a host guest.
What is the significance of the abstract noun part? Like how would you bring that over into English?
Thank you for providing the hospitality. But what's really helpful, I think, is how these extended letters, they describe the specific hospitality that she performed. And so that's what I'm trying to get at with Phoebe is how was she a host? How was she a prostatis? What exactly did she do? And so you can read these letters about Junia Theodora from the perspective of her host, of her guest, and the travelers who came to her, and see how she related to them and what she did on their behalf.
Okay. Was there anything in the article that you were hoping I was going to ask about that I didn't bring up or ask about?
No, I mean, just one final thing I would say. I feel like this. So Paul says that she was a host of me and many others. And so I would say that Paul, by the time he is writing this letter from Corinth, this is actually his third trip into Corinth, and Cenchreae was the port town on the eastern side of Corinth. So whenever anyone traveled between Corinth and Ephesus, they went through Cenchreae. And so this is Paul's third time in Corinth. He would have been traveling there to and from Ephesus or the eastern regions. He would have been traveling through the city. And so multiple occasions for her to be a host of Paul. But then the question is, who is the many others as well? And so what I propose, this is getting a little bit more into the realm of speculation, is that the people of Rome to whom Paul is writing were actually the people who received hospitality from her. Because we know that in the year 54, the Emperor Claudius kicked out Jews from the city of Rome, which would have included Jewish Christians who left Rome, and some of them would have scattered in different directions, and some of them would have come to Corinth essentially as political exiles or refugees there, and would have been dependent upon someone in the local Christian community to welcome them and to receive them as travelers. Now, they were not traveling as itinerant teachers, but more as kind of refugees, temporary, kicked out and displaced from their home. And so they would have benefited from that hospitality. And so this is a little bit more than just kind of, oh gosh, that might have happened theoretically, because we actually know the name of two people for whom that was actually the case. And that's Priscilla and Aquila. They were from Rome. They were kicked out, and then we read about them in Acts chapter 18. They come to Corinth. That's where Paul meets them. So they would have been known to the believers in Corinth. They traveled to Ephesus, and so they would have gone through the port city of Cenchreae. Obviously, now when Paul is writing Rome, they are back in Rome, which means they went back through Cenchreae and Corinth, and they are now in Rome. And so we actually know some specific people who, in all likelihood, I believe, would have been hosted by Phoebe. And so that becomes important because they have a social kind of debt, or there's a sense of obligation or expectation that they would reciprocate now that Phoebe is coming to them. And so I think Paul's selection of Phoebe is significant. Not only is she a prominent, respected figure within the community, but she is someone to whom the Romans would have been indebted, and therefore they would have received her. And this is significant because for the church in Rome to receive Paul's message, they would have to receive the messenger, right? And so that's a part of his strategy. So to get back to what I talked about at the beginning, why does Paul use this word, prostatis? Why does he introduce Phoebe in this way? And so the reason is because the Romans themselves, whom he wants to welcome her, has experienced her as their own prostatis, or their own patron host, as they were exiled out of Rome and came to Corinth.
Okay. Where to learn more about this, travel in early Christianity or Proxenia, prostatis, where would you send people? Books, YouTube, blogs, whatever?
Well,
for the listeners.
Obviously start with the article and the different footnotes that are there. The best book about Proxenia is by, I believe it's Mack. Yeah, William Mack, Proxenia and Polis. He has got a book about Oxford University Press. That is the most helpful one. As for travel in the ancient world, and so I have an article in the Journal of Early Christian History that's coming out in about a month that kind of looks at travel and the interpretations of travel within early Christian history. And that has a full bibliography where I interact with all the secondary works talking about travel in the ancient world. And I'm trying to think if there's kind of a more popular work. Nothing that comes to mind. And so there's an older work by Lionel Casson. I think it's like Travel in the Roman Empire from the 70s and 80s. That's a fun book to read as well. It could be updated as well. Obviously, there's a lot more evidence and a lot more precision. But that one by Lionel Casson is probably the best kind of one-stop popular book about travel in the ancient world.
Cool.
Oh,
What do you read for fun?
I don't read any fiction, and so I don't watch any movies. I can only really do nonfiction. So yeah, I read history books for fun. Sorry, I feel exposed and I feel lame, but that's just what I do. Or I enjoy kind of economics, foreign relations.
Look, some sage advice that I got from listening to an interview with Dave Grohl back in like 2013 was there's no such thing as guilty pleasures. If you
Don't
like
feel
it, you
guilty.
like it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, okay. Unless you have anything else for
Thank
us,
you.
I'm going
Yeah,
to call
was
this
a
one
real
good.
pleasure, Jared. Thank you for the chance to be on and chat about this with you.
Thank you
Bye.
for being here. Okay. Take care. Thank you so much for listening. Next week, my conversation with Kyle Rouse. We discuss the Mount Ebal altar episode. Here is a quick preview of that conversation. Take care.
Yeah, maybe one thing to say about the argument of the article is that, so there is this Mount Ebal episode appears in different locations in the Masoretic text, in the Septuagint, and at Qumran. And I'm trying to make an argument about the earliest location. And I think the Masoretic text location is the earliest location that we have of the Mount Ebal episode. And that's because in Neo-Assyrian inscriptions, narrated conquest ends with the installation of an inscribed image. And that's how I think the Mount Ebal altar episode functions in Joshua chapter 8. It's the conclusion of narrated warfare, and it's an expected conclusion. And I think that this is narratively and ritually very significant. It's not just that this is a common practice and it's kind of cool that you erect an inscribed image. It does something to community dynamics, and it stands as a marker for posterity of this conquest of Yahweh, and then also the instruction that Yahweh gave to Moses. So it unifies community. It is a marker for generations to look back on for the success that Yahweh has given his people. It does other ritual things as well, but that it loses that sort of essential function in the location of the Septuagint and the location in the Qumran text.